Hello, this is David Bernstein. I'm founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I'm here with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shafitsky. Hi, Brandy.
Hey, David.
So this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast. So we're here to be contrary, and we are going to be looking at anti-Semitism from both the left and the right. Now, I've been a part of a lot of panel discussions and programs where anti-Semitism is discussed. And one of the things you hear about are people from the left talking about anti-Semitism on the right, and people on the right talking about anti-Semitism on the left. And it turns out that this is not just anecdotal, that the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values conducted a poll in August of 2022. And the poll found that almost everybody across the political spectrum, center, left, and right, agree that anti-Semitism is a big problem in America today. But when they were asked where does it come from, it was always in the opposite camp. So people were pointing at each other, blaming each other for the anti-Semitism that was growing in America. And so we want to sort of go deeper there and ask ourselves, A, is it true that we have a problem from both ends of the political spectrum? How true is it? Is it more concentrated in a certain area? Is it more dangerous from a certain area? And what do we do about it? So I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation with Brandy, who has infinite wisdom on these topics, and we'll take it from here. So Brandy, let me just start. I won't go through my normal epic monologue. I want to get a sense from you how you think of anti-Semitism on both ends of the political spectrum.
I think that that's an excellent place to start. So I think that what we've been used to in the West, in the United States specifically, is being able to kind of define anti-Semitism as it relates to Nazis and neo-Nazis. So when we hear about things like the horrific mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the fact that the murderer happened to be hold neo-Nazi ideology wasn't a surprise. That seems to be a common way that we define and think about anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, we aren't thinking about it or considering it as much when it comes from places that don't look like that. And so, of course, one of the places that I work in and focus on is in education, and how we're seeing this incredible increase in anti-Semitism coming out of spaces that are usually, we're not used to seeing bigotry and anti-Semitism coming from those spaces, because we tend to think of them as enlightened and having evolved past bigotry. But when you look at the reports of anti-Semitic incidents, we're seeing where the spaces are coming from. And they're coming from spaces where most of the people that occupy those spaces tend to be left of center.
Yes. One time I did a poll using one of those phone polling technologies that we have with a group of Jewish college students, and asking them where they experienced the most anti-Semitism, which variant from the right or the left. And overwhelmingly, it was like 85% perceived it as a problem of the left. In other words, their experience on a college campus was not of a neo-Nazi coming in and painting swastikas, although that does happen, but rather of a professor or another group of students who were engaging in really harsh anti-Zionist rhetoric and treating them as if they were perpetrators because they were Jewish. So I think that we sometimes discount that form of anti-Semitism because it's a little less recognizable and may not feel as immediately threatening in terms of our physical well-being, but it is certainly the quote-unquote lived experience of a lot of Jews, and it is the one that I think is rising in a way that we should be very concerned about.
And I think that the idea that it's less physically threatening, the violence and violent anti-Semitic attacks are less physically threatening if they're coming from people other than neo-Nazis has actually been proven false over the past couple of years. We look at who's been attacked on the streets of New York, and it's usually not, those attacks aren't occurring, coming from neo-Nazis and white supremacists. They're coming from other groups. They're coming from people of color. When we look at the marches in, I don't remember which Midwestern university it was, calling to globalize the Intifada, calling for terrorist attacks against Jews. The people marching weren't neo-Nazis.
Right, exactly. Yes, and yet I was on a panel. I facilitated a panel with the security, the SCN. I'm blanking on what it stands for exactly, through the Secure Community Network, which is the umbrella arm of the security for the Jewish Federation system, and the former FBI agent who advises Jewish communities on security, who was part of the panel, said that, look, I mean, most of the threats that are coming his way to synagogues and Jewish institutions are coming from neo-Nazi right-wing groups. That, not all of them, but most. But again, it's not the only kind of physical threat, as you just pointed out as well, that he's likely to hear that, and he's never likely to pick up any intelligence on what's happening in a borough in New York City.
Right.
So, the other thing that strikes me that's different about anti-Semitism on the right and left, and I'm curious to get your point of view on this, is how we talk about them. So when we talk about anti-Semitism on the right, we have no problem talking about the underlying ideological underpinnings. So we talk about the Great Replacement theory and how Jews play this role in the collective imagination of the neo-Nazi groups, where they're bringing in all these immigrants. And so that's what actually animated the murderer, the killer in Squirrel Hill, who's on trial right now, by the way, in Pittsburgh. So we talk about that. We talk about the theological underpinnings of anti-Semitism, traditional anti-Semitism, and how it comes out of a certain view of Christian theology as well. We don't hesitate really to talk about it when it comes from the Muslim world, and how Islamism, that ideology, gave rise to a form of anti-Semitism and alienation. Yet somehow, when it comes to anti-Semitism on the left, we talk about it as just the symptoms of it, just the expressions of it. We don't talk about those underlying ideological underpinnings. What do you make of that?
One point I disagree with you on is I do think that there's a hesitation to talk about Islamist anti-Semitism. I think that there's a failure to recognize that supremacist ideology isn't color-based. There are supremacists that aren't white, and those supremacists are leading the charge in fueling anti-Semitism. We've seen it. And then there's this idea that if somebody happens to be Black or Arab or any other person of color, that they're automatically put on the side of the left. And an example would be, Louis Farrakhan. His ideology is in no way, shape, or form left-leaning or progressive. He's not only anti-Semitic, he's homophobic, he's misogynistic. He's made all of these statements against all of these groups that if he were white, he would easily be recognized as far right or a nationalist or a white supremacist, when in fact he's a Black supremacist. So I think that's one thing that we also aren't having the conversation about anti-Semitism that's coming out of Islamist ideology, which again is a far right ideology. It's not progressive, it's not to the left, but it's painted that way because people seem to have a difficult time recognizing that non-white people can also be supremacists.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because, and I may be dating myself here to a certain degree, because I remember a time when we could speak openly about Islamist anti-Semitism. And when I was writing an article about the various forms of anti-Semitism, I went back and looked at the sources of people who had written about it, and almost all of them were writing in the sort of early part of the 2000s and not more recently. So it has definitely become more taboo to talk about Islamist anti-Semitism than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago when you could talk about it. I mean, you wouldn't have talked about 9/11 and what happened in America without talking about the underlying ideology that caught on. And there were myriad conversations about how 9/11 was a product of a very specific ideology that had taken hold of the Muslim world. Now, there were people who would have called that racist even at that time. Any critique of the Muslim world was considered off limits. but you could, generally speaking, talk like that because and you had to, because you were talking about a series of threats to the United States. That permission structure that we had in place during that time seems to have sort of given way to the same forces that make it impossible to talk about anti-Semitism coming from the left.
Yeah, and I think that there have been Islamist or Islamist adjacent organizations that have done a very good job of painting any critique of Islamist ideology as being Islamophobic. And I don't know if we want to, mention those organizations here, but they have a foothold. Like CARE, they have a foothold in left and progressive spaces with this facade of them being progressive organizations, when in fact their ideology, you barely have to scratch the surface to see that their ideology is very nationalist, it's very supremacist, and it's very bigoted.
Exactly. So when we talk about anti-Semitism on the left, what are we talking about? What is giving rise to the anti-Semitism on the left? What is giving rise to the anti-Semitism in the Muslim world? What is giving rise to the anti-Semitism among a small segment in the Black community? What is giving rise to anti-Semitism on the far right? How do you think about those various causes and sources?
I mean, I think that the ideologies that what fuels them may come from slightly different places, but they all have close similarities. One is supremacist ideology. One is, when you look at anti-Semitism on the left, it's usually rooted in ideology that wants to see any group that has any perceived or real success as having gained that success through some nefarious, in some nefarious manner. So if again, and it's real or perceived success, but the ideology that, the Jews have all the power or the money, like this nefarious group of people that only gained money or power through exploitation, one, without acknowledging that that's just, that trope is a stereotype and it's not true. And even if it were true, that doesn't mean that success has been gotten on the backs of other people. And that's what we see on the left. But we also see that ideology on the right, where you hear people that, well, the Jews control X and that makes them bad. Like there's, so there are those similarities, I think, between, far left anti-Semitism and far right anti-Semitism and all of the other ones that we're experiencing, unfortunately.
Yeah, we call that the horseshoe of anti-Semitism these days, where what a phenomena that began on the right, might look very similar on the left and vice versa. Before you know it, the right starts to mimic the far left, and the far left starts to mimic the far right, and how they talk about anti-Semitism. So it's not unusual to hear the far right anti-Semite talk about Jewish privilege in a way, maybe in a way to stoke the far left and get them to be more join the fray. But in any event, they're sounding an awful lot like each other.
I think we've seen this before. Both the communists who were on the left and the fascists who were on the right were highly anti-Semitic.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim Urban, who is a writer and thinker, just came out with this book. He's brilliant, by the way. And if you have a chance to read the book or even hear one of his podcasts, I'd highly recommend them. His book, I think, is called "What's Our Problem?" A Society Self-Help Book. I may have that slightly wrong, but I'm in the ballpark. And what he does is sort of analyzes how America became more ideological in the past 20 years or so. There's a whole series of sources that we could probably all talk about. But he says that basically on both the right and the left, you have what he would call a golem. A golem is like this sort of amorphous monster that has taken on a life of its own. And the right-wing golem is, highly alienated. It's what he would call, in both cases, by the way, engaging in low-rung thinking. In other words, unscientific thinking. So you have a right-wing golem that's looking for easy scapegoats for the problems. It's looking for simplistic explanations for problems, that is basically dissatisfied about society, but doesn't have a very productive way of dealing with it because they're not able to engage in sort of a rational scientific discourse. And the exact same thing exists on the left-wing golem. And yes, they're different. And yes, they talk differently. They sound differently. But they're both irrational. They're both engaged in a kind of low-rung thinking. I would extend the thesis that's actually what gives rise to anti-Semitism, is that these golems that have been generated in the current ideological ferment and the current social ferment are now becoming the source of anti-Semitism on both the right and the left. What do you think of that thesis?
I think that's a fascinating way to look at it, to think about is the rise of unsophisticated critical thinking fueling anti-Semitism. I think that's yeah.
Yeah, and it may be that we were never really great critical thinkers, but we all sort of deferred to Walter Cronkite and sort of this common narrative that had set in, the sort of responsible narrative that set in. And there were always people on the margins who were either silent or seething in their discontent. But they were sort of cast aside by the sort of established narrative. And when the established narrative was sort of disrupted and taken apart, and we had the fragmentation of social media and political gerrymandering and everything else, instead what emerged were these amorphous monster-like networks of opinion that are less rational. Even if Walter Cronkite wasn't perfect and didn't always get it right, it was better than having these sort of uncontrolled masses that are sort of generating their own opinion out of just fear and anger and so forth.
I mean, I always wonder what happens when we get to the point where truth doesn't matter, especially when we're talking about an ideology like anti-Semitism that relies on conspiracy theories and false narratives and historical revisionism. So when we're at a point of my truth instead of the truth, is that part of, do you think that's part of?
Yeah. I think, in some ways we talk about how postmodernism, which postmodernism believes that power is what determines truth. In other words, knowledge is determined not by scientific inquiry, but by who has the power and how they're using the power to establish the dominant discourse, and how then the dominant discourse then generates what we call considered knowledge. That's postmodernism in a nutshell. And the problem with that is that it really is sort of post-truth. It's saying that truth is in the eyes of the beholder in a way. It's in the eyes of the people who have the power, who get to dictate it for the rest of society. So if you believe that, and then you're going to just try to exercise power. But I think what that line of thinking has sort of certainly sunk in on the left and has become a dominant discourse, if you will, on the left. But I think it's been mimicked by the right. I think the people on the right don't realize that they're very quick to sort of condemn wokeism, which uses and relies on postmodernist ideologies, but they themselves are actually engaging in it as well when they sort of deny, when they argue that there is no real truth, or they're willing to, as I think Steve Bannon put it, flood the airways with shit. I'm not sure if that's a direct quote, but it's close. So I do think you're pointing out right that if both, just like the horseshoe on anti-Semitism, the horseshoe of truth or lack thereof is also affecting people's attitudes toward Jews.
I think part of it too is there isn't a real that what it means to be liberal or what it means to be conservative don't hold true to what those words mean anymore. Right. Especially as it relates to things like anti-Semitism or censorship and free speech. They just don't mean what the word originally meant.
Yeah, there are certainly, the modern day Republican Party isn't practicing, traditional conservatism anymore. They spend, just like they used to accuse Democrats of spending, and so it's interesting. I agree, and I don't know, if this manifests itself in society in the same way. The golem of the right tends to be a political golem. And be sort of a dominant force within, let's say, Republican politics. And the golem on the left, I think, is less of a function of the current Democratic Party. I know there are people who dispute this, and more of a creation of sort of institutional life where progressivism dominates. So, if you work for a human service organization or even a corporation or a scientific organization or whatever, institutions tend to be taken over by that golem that insist that they think and behave in a certain way all the time, or they're engaging in, sort of a kind of bigotry, and the right wing golem is really taking over the party. What do you think of that thesis?
I think it begs the question then, which is more dangerous?
Right. What is more dangerous?
Right. When hate or bigotry or ignorance is coming from the political sphere or the social sphere, and this is where I when asked the question, where, is anti-Semitism more dangerous coming from the left or the right? To me, they're equally dangerous, just in different ways.
Yeah. So
I have a security guard at my synagogue because of right-wing anti-Semitism, but my kids go to Jewish day school instead of the local public school or another local private school because of left-wing anti-Semitism.
Interesting. Yeah. So I quote him frequently on this. Jonathan Greenblatt likes to say that anti-Semitism on the right is like a hurricane, and anti-Semitism on the left is like climate change. And I've always said that
another line there, and we're in a climate crisis now.
Right. Well, I think you killed my punchline on this, because I was having lunch with this guy, very smart person. I'm not going to name him because he didn't give me permission to quote him here, but he goes, I like that analogy, but the thing about climate change that people don't realize is it's supposedly a human extinction level event. In other words, it's not that it should be taken more lightly than the hurricane. It actually is causing tremendous dislocation, and we should understand it for what it is, the threat what it is. The other thing that Jonathan leaves out, and one of my other favorite lines, is that when we're willing to talk about the causes of the hurricane on the right, we're willing to talk about Great Replacement theory, we're willing to talk about Christian theology, or at least it's in its older, more traditional forms, that causes anti-Semitism. But we're very reluctant to talk about the ideological CO2 emissions on the left that are producing the climate change on the left. And that, I think, makes it harder for us to actually fight back, because you're not naming the disease. It's like saying, well, you're just naming the symptoms. So you're not naming the disease, and you can actually end up doing the same things over and over again because you're actually not naming the disease.
I think you just pointed out one of the real problems that we have, at least in the American Jewish community, mainstream community right now, is that not only are we not naming or discussing the disease, some members of the mainstream community are participating in fueling it, which may make it harder for them to actually see, because then they would have to reflect on how are they contributing to climate change, because there are actions they're actively taking that I believe are contributing to the rise in anti-Semitism coming out of the far left.
Yeah. So I'm about to have in a couple hours a meeting with a mainstream Jewish leader. And the word on the street about him is that he thinks that what we do and say is divisive. Like that's like we're dividing people by naming the problem on the left. Because clearly, by the way, in some sense, it is divisive. Like there are people who don't want us to talk about it, so they get upset. And so when we talk about it, we are participating in the division that is emerging, or the controversy that is emerging. Yet, so it's fascinating, because of course, I don't think that this person, by the way, is of that category that you just mentioned, is actually actively fomenting it by engaging in the ideology that's causing anti-Semitism. I think he just worries, or she just worries, that it's a function, that by talking about it, we're generating controversy and division in our own community. I feel like that might be even the more dominant problem in talking about anti-Semitism on the left.
I agree. I just think that makes the fight against anti-Semitism partisan, and it shouldn't be. And I don't think that either of us have ever tried to minimize anti-Semitism that comes from one side of the political aisle in order to shout down the anti-Semitism that comes from the other. And when you're combating any type of bigotry, you are combating the bigotry. It doesn't matter where it's coming from.
Right.
If it's wrong, it's wrong.
So I want you to help me prepare for this meeting I'm about to have. I'm going to say that that you can't fight the anti-Semitism on the left if you can't name its ideological underpinnings, and we've talked a lot about what those ideological underpinnings are. So the question is, why? What about the and you know, you named one of them that, well, some people are actually going to continue to do the idea, engage in the ideology that's causing anti-Semitism. So we're contributing to the problem that we're trying to fight. So that's one aspect of it. What are other ways that this sort of ties our hands?
I mean, I think that that's the main one. To make ourselves willfully blind or willfully ignorant to a problem isn't going to make the problem go away. And I mean, maybe that's not the most delicate way to say it, but I believe it's true. I think that if we look at those of us who are parents or grandparents or uncles or aunts who have kids that are going into school and going into college, I ask, are the actions that we're taking in the Jewish professional world, the actions that we're taking, that we're active in, making it easier for our Jewish kids or harder? Because to me, that's really what it comes down to. Are we acknowledging what they're facing and experiencing, and are we working to combat the Jew hatred that they're experiencing? Or are we gonna tell ourselves it's not that bad until something worse happens? And you know, I've been an advocate professionally with domestic violence and sexual assault victims and survivors, and I don't believe turning a blind eye to the problem is ever that part of the solution.
Right. So I want to throw out a couple other possible ways that this sort of ties our hands. You know, we deal a lot with ethnic studies and how it emerges in different parts of the country, and some Jewish organizations say, well, unless the school district is adopting a curriculum that's specifically anti-Semitic toward Jews, then we should just let it go, because and what we're seeing is a lot of school districts are not adopting the specific language. Some are, that holds that Israel is a settler colonial state and American Jewish organizations are part of the grand conspiracy, but rather they're trading in the underlying ideology of settler colonialism, of the idea that of the oppressor binary, and because they don't want to talk about the ideological antecedents to anti-Semitism, they're willing to let that slide. And pretend that it's only the anti-Semitic symptoms that matter rather than the underlying ideological underpinnings. So that's another way that it might actually tie our hands in dealing with it. The other way, it seems to me, is it makes us think that we can make headway with certain partners in other organizations that have sort of really bought into this ideology, when I think we could be fooling ourselves. So if we're engaging with certain ethnic partners that have, and I mean specific groups, I don't mean races or ethnicities, but specific groups that have really bought into this ideology, it's going to be very hard to sway them on our issues because they're so bought into this oppressor binary. And it also ties our hands in the sense that we're no longer actually trying to get to know new allies that are not bound by that ideology, because again, we've decided to sort of blind ourselves to the ideological antecedents. So we may be actually working with partners who are unproductive or even hostile, and not reaching out to the partners that could actually be true allies.
I think a lot of this is rooted in unfortunately in a lot of ignorance towards what a democratic republic actually needs to thrive, for its citizens to thrive and live in liberty and freedom, and small L liberalism. And I think that that's part of the issue. That ideology that's fueling a lot of the very negative and divisive and partisan ethnic studies and other type of curricula coming through schools, that ideology isn't good for anyone who lives in this nation. It's not good for Black Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. It's not good for any group. And we could talk in an academic way about why and how that's harmful. But I think it really comes down to, do you believe in small d democratic principles of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, equality for all, those types of things? And I think that that's the bigger conversation. If a group buys into the idea that those things are bad and negative, I see why they would hesitate then to call out the issues with this ideology. But to me, the big broader conversation is, what type of ideology in society do we need to actually have more people than not live with freedom and liberty and justice?
Exactly. Well, it's going to take a lot of reframing for people to understand how anti-Semitism on the left, A, manifests, even though I think that's less controversial, and B, much more controversial, is where it's coming from and how to fight it. And I think we have our work cut out for us. Yes, anti-Semitism on the right is a huge threat, but it's really easy to talk about. We understand it. It's part of our experience. Yet, some reason, when we talk about anti-Semitism on the left, there's a sort of historic blind spot in the Jewish community. By the way, that didn't start with the emergence of woke ideology. It actually, even if you look back like 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago in America, when, Stalinist Soviet Union was in effect, you had Jews who were still expressing affection for the communist enterprise and Stalinism. I mean, you had a significant number of Jews who were blind to that set of threats because they'd fallen in love with the underlying ideology. And
well, I mean, to be fair, it's easy to be a communist in a free society.
Yeah, that is true. It is easy to be communist, but it shows you that our potential for blindness, if we can't see the threat and the fact that Stalin was killing millions of people, including Jews, if we can't struggle with that, then it's no surprise that we can't struggle with an admittedly much less immediately threatening ideology as wokeness in American society, which is also giving rise to anti-Semitism very much in the Soviet vein, in the Soviet anti-Zionist vein. So, all right. Well, I think we're at 32 minutes, and I think we've done justice to the topic. So, thank you, Brandy,
Thanks,
and Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.